Joining us right now to discuss this is former CIA case officer Lisa Ruth. Great to have you here, Lisa. And before we get to those comments, it seems as though, based on what Putin is saying most recently about the calls for both sides in this ongoing conflict to lay down their arms, that he is concerned about the implications of what happened.
I completely agree with you. I think he's scrambling like mad right now. You know, what we saw yesterday, his immediate reaction was, this is Ukraine's fault. Ukraine has to secure its own airspace. That kind of bellicose statement. Now what we're hearing today is everybody needs to lay down their arms. I think he's trying to figure out exactly what the repercussions are going to be, and I think he knows they're going to be pretty severe.
All right, we also want to bring in Dan Kochis, who's an expert from the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the the Heritage Foundation. Dan, I'm going to grab a drink of water real quickly, but I also want you to comment. How exposed and marginalized is Putin here?
Well, he's pretty exposed. It's going to be interesting to see what they do if it's indeed found that the black box has gone to Moscow, if they deny sort of that the weapons came from Russia or whatnot. But he's pretty exposed, and I think Lisa's right. He is scrambling. His initial reaction was one that this is Ukraine's fault. Now he realizes that the evidence may come out that this is indeed the separatists in the east, and there could be some very serious ramifications for him that he's trying to mitigate.
All right, and based on this, I want to play those clips. The New York Times has them up on the website. Intercepted communications where separatists led by alleged leader Igor Stelkov called Moscow 3 times. Let's listen in to those intercepted communications.
Только что сбили самолет, группа минера за Янакиева упал. Поехали искать и фотографировать сбитый самолет. Дымится. Сколько минут назад? Ну, 30 минут назад где-то.
200-го. Была женщина. Да, гражданский. Да, Саш.
Ну, что у вас там?
Короче, блин, стопудово гражданский борт.
Понятно. А этот, как, народу много там?
Там остатки внутренних кронштейнов, кресла, тела.
Понятно.
Вот так.
Из вооружения есть что-нибудь?
Вообще ничего. Гражданские вещи, медицинские ошметки, там полотенце такое, туалетная бумага.
По самолету, сбитым в районе Снежного Тереза.
Ну?
Это оказался пассажирский. Упал в районе Грабова, там море трупов, женщины, дети. Сейчас казаки там смотрят это все дело. По телевизору передают вроде бы как этот, Ан-26 украинский транспортник. Но, говорят, написано на нем малазийские авиалинии. И что он делал на территории Украины?
Ну, значит, завозили шпионов, них нахуй.
Well, Dan, I don't know if you speak Russian or not, but you know the long and short of that conversation is it appears like, if you read into that, they were asking about weapons. When there were no weapons mentioned, they talked about women and children, and it appears that they thought that this might have been a transport carrier. We know that 2 other aircraft have been shot down in the last few days that were Ukrainian aircraft. Now, if this is a mistake, and that's what this might point to here, what do we expect from Putin now to respond?
I think when we look at this, you have to say, I think it was a mistake. I'll say that for starters. I don't believe they were targeting passenger aircraft. But you know, we look at what we know this was a passenger plane. We know it was at 33,000 feet. We know that it was a surface-to-air missile that struck it. The question is who did it, and I think if you look at it analytically, it has to be the separatists. It's just highly unlikely that Ukraine's government would have been shooting down airplanes out of the sky. So then we're now at how they got the weapons, and we don't know that. We do know probably this is a Russian-made weapon.
But from the Soviet era.
But from the Soviet era. We also pretty much can guess or analyze here that either the Russians supplied it to them, or they took it when they overran the military post. But there had to be Russian involvement. As you and I discussed earlier, you don't just go onto these things and push the big red launch button. Yeah. There was training, there were codes. So the question is, Russian involvement at some level means Russia has to respond. And I think we're going to have to look at whether Putin is going to directly intervene, whether he can. How much control does he have over these separatists?
And that might be what's most dangerous about this, is that Putin, while letting these weapons walk out the back door of his country and into eastern Ukraine, not being able to stop this from happening and not stopping these mistakes, if in fact was one. Now, Dan, I wanted to bring you in here, and we mentioned this guy Igor Strelkov, the self-proclaimed leader of these separatists. apparently calling Russia there. What does that say to you about the Russian involvement, or the prospect of Russian involvement here?
I think that there's clearly been Russian involvement, whether or not that this is from the weapons system, from the training standpoint. You know, obviously these separatist leaders look at Russia as sort of as a protector, as an overlord. I think that it was pretty obvious that they thought that this was a Ukrainian military jet that they were shooting down. In fact, it was a passenger airline. I do think it was a mistake. But at the end of the day, Russia still bears the blame, the brunt of the blame, because they created the conditions on the ground that allow something like this to happen. The dangerous thing is, as you mentioned before, is that, you know, on a day-to-day basis, how much control does Putin have over these factions? There is some tribalism there, where they're sort of, you know, kind of doing their own thing. But at the end of the day, they're still looking to Russia as sort of the basis of their power.
Yeah, and you know, this would like be the equivalent. These separatists, they're not an international, you know, force, military force like we think of the Russian military or a state actor here. This is essentially the equivalent, Dan, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, of maybe like a U.S. biker gang that runs meth across the western part of the U.S. actually attaining surface-to-air missiles, or a Mexican drug cartel obtaining surface-to-air missiles.
These are thugs. These are local thugs. There have been some reports that there's some payment coming from Russia, and some of them actually are obviously Russian citizens. A lot of the leaders are also Russian citizens. But this is exactly right. This isn't necessarily a very organized sort of state actor. These are gangs, thugs that have taken over and gotten access potentially to these weapons.
And Lisa, back to you. We know that there has been an international effort to contain the Russian nuclear arsenal. But if these are in fact Soviet-era Russian weapons being used to shoot down commercial airliners, what are the chances that nuclear material might also be out there in the sphere of some of these groups that Putin or anybody else can't control?
You know, for right now, we have not heard these reports, but again, this is a huge danger. At the point when you have weapons that are uncontrolled, and to your point, and I agree completely with you, Dan, these guys are thugs. They're untrained. They don't have an allegiance. You know, you're putting weapons in the hands of people who are unpredictable, unreliable. Even if it's an accident, shooting down planes suggests these guys are taking actions that are irresponsible, probably unplanned even. And the nuclear question is a wild card. It's certainly something I think we have to look at.
And Dan, you know, we talked about what we expect to hear from Putin, what else we expect to hear from him today. What do you think we should hear from the administration here in the United States today?
Well, the administration needs to be very clear, one, with the evidences the United States has, that this was, in fact, shot from the Russian separatists, the pro-Russian separatists in the East. So they need to be very clear and very methodical about putting that information out there and countering sort of Russian propaganda, Russian subterfuge on the issue. But they also need to make very clear that there are serious ramifications for this, whatever those may be. This can't be this sort of backpedaling. There needs to be very serious ramifications, and our European allies need to be on board, and the administration needs to be working towards that.
And Lisa, what kind of response, you know, we heard Hillary Clinton last night on Charlie Rose talking about the need for Europe to step up here in this situation. We'll talk more about that as well, but what do you expect to hear from Europe?
I think we're going to have strong condemnations, but again, up to this point, there's been a hesitancy to really crack down because of concerns about things like oil shipments and energy shipments. I think we've now gone beyond that, and Europe does have to step up. Again, going back to what Dan said, I think you're right. I think that we, the U.S. as an administration, has to prohibit Putin and the Europeans and everybody else from pivoting. You know, we're going to blame the Ukrainians for lack of control over territory or something like that. We have to really pin this down. Russia has got to take responsibility, whether it's direct or indirect. And I think that Europe, again, back to that scrambling thing, everybody's probably trying now to scramble and figure out what can we do, because you have to really clamp down at this point.
Yeah, and Dan, we know that the president announced that latest round of sanctions before this happened. Is there any other sanctions, anything short of further military action the U.S. can do in the short term?
Sure. I mean, obviously they can go further with sanctions. I mean, the most recent round of sanctions was targeting specific companies. The problem here is that basically just it hurts these companies getting access to U.S. capital, but they can sort of do this end around and go to Europe and other places to get that, to Asia and whatnot. So it's very important to have our allies on board putting in place much stronger sanctions. And also the U.S. could go further with more broad, wide, sector-specific sanctions on the Russians.
All right, Dan, if you could stick around, we're going to go to a commercial break in about a minute and a half, but we'll continue this conversation with you on the other side of this. So please stick around. And Lisa, before we go to that commercial break, I want to get a quick assessment from you. We know there were Americans likely involved here on the plane. What is the FBI and CIA doing right now? Are they already on the ground investigating this?
I think they're probably trying to be. The question is if they can get there, and this is one of the complicating factors, is the black box is great, but really we know it was a missile at this point. We have got to get access to the crash site. The forensic evidence is going to be critical at this point. And the question is how much access the CIA, the FBI is going to have.
All right, and we know, at least from some reports earlier today, that Ukrainian authorities did not even have access to the crash site because it is under the control of these Russian separatists. That's complicating the problem. If we think back to Benghazi, how long it took the FBI to get access to the U.S. compound, they're technically U.S. sovereign soil. So there could be some serious delays here as this investigation continues, but more bodies being pulled from the wreckage, women and children, as the separatists seem to notice themselves there in that audio recording we played for you. Much more to come here on America's Forum. We're going to continue to look at this situation, and we'll have much more on the drama playing out in Gaza right now with the ground invasion ongoing, the Israeli military ready to step that up as well if rockets keep coming into Israel. We'll be back with Lisa Ruth and Dan Kochis right after this from the Heritage Foundation. More ahead here right after this short commercial break.